I'd like to welcome everybody to today's Exploring the Mind. I was going to say lecture, but we're going to do something a little different today. So we have the great honor of having Dr. Paul Ekman here. I think everybody in the room knows who Dr. Ekman is. And we're going to do something a little different, where we will have a conversation. So Cliff Sarin, who has known Paul for 30 years, is going to interview him, and they're going to converse about some interesting topics that I'm sure you will find fascinating. And so this will be a little different. It's an experiment, and I think it's going to be great. So thank you all for coming. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cliff, who will do the formal introduction.
Thank you. So welcome to the first Investigating the Mind conversation.
I'm sure you converse all the time.
We do. So it's really an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to have Paul with us today. Paul has been my friend and mentor, colleague, and collaborator for close to 30 years in many different contexts. And it's one of the great riches of my life to have been working with Paul over the arc of time that we've had together, and which keeps going. So a little bit about Paul. He was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and New York University. He had the remarkable benefit of never graduating from high school and entering the University of Chicago at age 15. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Adelphi University in 1958 after a year-long internship at Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute in San Francisco. Then he did 2 years as a clinical psychology officer in the U.S. Army. And he returned to Langley Porter, where he really spent the great bulk of his career from 1960 until retiring in 2004. So his life now is anything but retired. His research on facial expression and body movement began in 1954. I was a baby. As the subject of his master's thesis in 55, with his first publication in 1957. And over the next decade, he took a social, psychological, and cross-cultural emphasis that characterized his work with a growing interest in the evolutionary and semiotic frame of reference of the function of gesture, sign, emotional expression. And during this time, he conducted his seminal work identifying the universality of facial signs of basic emotions. Out of that work came the world standard for being able to measure in an objective manner facial action, so that we have the facial action coding system of Paul Ekman and Wally Friesen, which is the gold standard for knowing what's happening on the face when that can be interpreted in terms of emotional experience. In addition to his basic research on emotional expression, he's, for the last 30 years, been studying deceit, which we're going to talk about today. 40. All right, this is an old bio. So in 2000, about 10 years ago, Paul had an opportunity to speak about his work in a very small, intimate meeting with the Dalai Lama. And I can attest, things are not quite the same after that kind of opportunity. And since that encounter, this had led over the ensuing years to nothing less than 35 hours of one-on-one conversation about the nature of emotion and compassion and psychology with the Dalai Lama. And this is the subject of Paul's latest book, Emotional Awareness, Overcoming Obstacles to Compassion. So that's why compassion is the first topic today. Paul is currently the manager of the Paul Ekman Group, a small company that produces training devices relevant to emotional skills and initiates new research relevant to national security and law enforcement. His work has been supported by the NIH for over 40 years. He has over 100 publications, 13 books in numerous editions, numerous awards, including the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, the highest Award in Psychology from the American Psychological Association, honorary doctorates from the University of Chicago and Adelphi, William James Fellow Award from the American Psychological Society, named one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century from the American Psychological Association, and last year in 2009, he was one of Time's 100 most influential people. So it is a great honor to have you
Thanks.
with us. So I want to begin talking about compassion, because it feels better to begin talking about
Did you notice
compassion.
what you just did? You shifted slightly in the chair,
Yes.
which is a signal of a change in role and relationship. You shifted from being introducer to being questioner. I'll try to inhibit such
I would
comments.
actually encourage you to not inhibit those at all, because I think
Oh, it's
that
such a classic, you know? It's one of the things I teach people. You know, you go to see the doctor who happens to be a friend, so you have the chit-chat, you know, what's the best Chinese restaurant you've been at recently and all that. And then you want to tell them about the reason I'm here to see you, and you do just what you just did. Change in role, change in posture. Anyhow.
well, please
Go ahead,
keep,
go ahead.
Please keep doing that. So I want to begin a little bit in the vein of the way you began with the dialogue with the Dalai Lama that we had going back to several years. You made a very important distinction between emotions and moods. And I'd like you to talk about the function of each. And I know you draw on an evolutionary account of emotion. So could you begin? It's an interesting thing that something so central to our inner lives that we talk about all the time could exist without a name in some cultures. For instance, there's no word for emotion in Tibetan.
And there's no distinction between emotions and moods, and one of the reasons why the Dalai Lama liked it so much is really a conflict. Do I look at you or do I look at them? You know, it's
Well, I think you should answer them and look at me for more.
so I'll be letting you know when I want more. Okay, so the distinction between emotions and mood, which he had never heard of before, allowed him to explain aspects of his own behavior and the behavior of others that previously he couldn't. And it is, once again, I used to look at a silent world, expression and gesture, and then I turned on the sound, and if you look and listen, of course you get a lot more. That's what nature gave us the ability to. But without a conceptual framework, you can't work with things. You can't anticipate them. You can't analyze them afterwards. You can't make use of it. So even have as simple a distinction as emotion and moods opens up a self-understanding that wasn't there if you didn't have that. They are there. You don't need me to give you a separate label for each, but you don't have a way to think about them. And that's, in the claims of some, I remain an agnostic, that's a unique feature of humans as compared to other primates, is that we can reflect upon the experience because we have this extraordinary symbol system. But without the conceptual framework, the symbol system doesn't do us any work. We can't use it. So I could go on for a long time. If I had known you were going to ask this, I would have brought the PowerPoint, which is
Well, this
in
is
your
a,
car
this is an
at the moment.
unrehearsed.
But
This is an unrehearsed dialogue. So
I think the most important differences between them, the common features, we don't choose either one. We don't choose, except when we cheat the system with technology and we rent a movie that we know is going to make us cry or give us a terror workout. But fundamentally, the nature of life is that emotions happen to us. They're unchosen, and so do moods. Usually we can figure out afterwards why we became emotional. We usually can't figure out afterwards why a mood seized us. I make the bold claim that without emotions, life wouldn't work. I agree with Sylvan Tompkins. They are primary motives. Hunger, sex are fragile compared to the power of emotion to override them. But we usually don't know why in the world we woke up in an irritable or dysphoric mood. And we can't account for it. I make the claim that moods are by definition dysfunctional. That they, like emotions, they distort or at least narrow what we can see. In an emotion, I've talked about a refractory period during which we can only perceive things that fit the emotion. And things that would disconfirm it are outside our awareness. Even worse, we can only draw on memories that fit the emotion. Well, if it only is a few seconds or a few minutes, there's a limit to the damage you do. But if it's all day, my gosh, you're going through that whole day misinterpreting. When you're in an irritable mood, you're looking for a chance to be angry. And you'll interpret things in a way that fit that mood. I think when you're in an irritable mood, you should wear a little sign that says, "Don't talk to me." So I think clearly another important difference, but such an obvious one, is duration. Emotions can come and go. I've maintained in seconds or minutes. I think I'm one of the few people that's looked at long stretches of behavior. When someone says I was angry for the last hour, what you see is multiple episodes of anger, not a continuous steady state. At least I haven't been able to see that in any of the situations that I've examined. And I've looked at naturally occurring social behavior in a number of cultures, but it's still a limited sample. We don't know, they're similar in terms of the narrowing of and the filtering of information. Moods must be, I have a theory, it's just a theory. No one has ever taken it seriously enough to test it, and I have a notebook of ideas. If I had 3 more lifetimes, I would try to test. I'm sure it happens to all of us. There's so many interesting possibilities, and so little, takes such a long time to do something thoroughly, like my friend Clifford does. It's one of the most thorough. It shouldn't be a distinction. Scientists, they're thorough. I have the prejudice, perhaps, that distinction is more necessary in the social sciences than in the life sciences or physical sciences. It may only be because I don't know those people as well. Maybe there are as many people running too quickly through the data in those fields. I think you get caught more often because everybody tries to replicate or not replicate each other's work, and that's practically unknown. I had the good fortune. Boy, am I digressing from your question?
I was just sitting here wondering, when do I interrupt you?
Okay. I had the good fortune that an anthropologist, Carl Heider, learned about my findings from New Guinea and was totally convinced I must be wrong because the people he had been studying, just as remote as the people I had been studying, the Dani, they didn't even have words for emotion. So he agreed that he was going back to the field. He'd spend a week or 2 in my lab, and I'd teach him how to do exactly what I did, gave him all the materials. He went, and he got a perfect replication. To have an antagonist replicate your work, wow, who could ask for more? Of course, it ruined his career.
So this is a perfect...
He's a cultural anthropologist. You're not supposed to find universals.
Yes, thank you. This is a perfect entree for my next question, which really touches on your current conceptualization and theoretical view of basic emotions. I'm going to read these questions I've written, like Cliff, as Erica suggested. Cliff from Corte Madera asks, what does it mean to say an emotion is basic? How many are there? How does the variety and nuance of emotion
One
lie?
at a time. I'm not going to be able to remember them.
Since you are the world expert on this area, I'm going to ask you to listen, and then you'll come back with an integrated response.
That's why I brought this. Okay.
Okay. First, how many basic emotions are there? What does it mean to say an emotion is basic? Is this like a primary color, something that's universal, or something that's culturally? I mean, I'm just giving you these things to make you wince. How does the variety and nuance of emotional life come from basic emotions? Is it blends and context, or they're non-basic emotions? Done.
End of list, huh?
End of list.
Okay, I think I wrote something once somewhere that said all emotions are basic, if it's an emotion. In that sense, it's a foolish distinction, at least from my vantage point. Somewhere I have, I think it's even in an APA journal, I have an article in which I just listed 6 or 7 characteristics of so-called basic emotions, The most controversial one was, if you can't find it in other primates, it's probably not an emotion. I didn't say it's probably, but I'm doing that now to be more gentle. That is to find an emotion for which you have a unique physiology, you have fast appraisal that sets it off, usually faster than consciousness enters in. That has a signal in voice or face that's distinctive and universal, that filters the information that's coming in as long as you are in the grip of that emotion. My next to the last book, the title was Gripped by Emotion, and Amazon overruled it and said, if it has that title, we'll put it in with mysteries. So Amazon won, and the book's called Emotions Revealed. Let me think. Usually brief. The briefest part is the signal. But I think there's, from joint work I did primarily with Bob Levinson and some with Richie Davidson, certainly some of the autonomic features are there for a while. If you think of the near-miss car accident is the best example for the argument I like to make about what emotions are. By the time you've made these complex adjustments in learned, I emphasize, italicized, learned behaviors, all of the steering wheel and foot pedal and visual estimations we do are all things we didn't learn till we were 16. They weren't part of the ancestral environment, and yet we deploy them in usually under a quarter of a second without thought. So I should say that another characteristic of emotions is that what initially guides them isn't conscious thought. That comes in if you're lucky, if you're skilled. Those are alternatives. You can have this with just luck, just the luck of the genetic draw, or you can do elaborate exercises to acquire the ability to bring consciousness in to an emotional experience. The most skilled bring it in between impulse and action. My last year as a psychotherapist, I was trained and wanted to be a psychotherapist. In 1957, my supervisor said to me, if you can increase the gap between impulse and action, you'll have been an enormous benefit to your patients. What he should have said, and we don't know how to do that in psychology or psychiatry. Well, the Buddhists talk about the spark before the flame, exactly the same concept.
So this is, tell
But
me, are you up?
they have some exercises. I think there are exercises from a Western point of view, and this is what I tried to do in the book with the Dalai Lama and in Emotions Revealed, is to try to interconnect them that can help us acquire that. But in some sense, it depends on what I think is your biologically established emotional experiencing profile, how steep, for example, the gradient is for the onset of emotion. If you watch Obama, he's an amazing example of something that we have found but never published, because I've reached the stage in life that if I learn the answer, I don't want to spend the time. I want to get another answer. I don't want to spend the time publishing it. It takes such a long time to get something published. But Obama has a very shallow, takes him a long time to get angry, and unbelievably steep. He goes from 0 to maximum on enjoyment. And that's just what we found in this unpublished research 12, 14 years ago, is that you really have two different profiles. And I'm going to try to now I'm going to speed up, Cliff, because I don't even want to get another question. There are 7 emotions that have all the characteristics I've talked about. There are, I don't know what to do about shame and guilt. I mean, they don't have recognizably different signals, no matter what some people claim. They haven't done the proper test to be certain. I can't decide what the hell to do with envy. There it is. What is it? Doesn't have a signal. It's not a matter of choice. We don't like to talk about it. But then recently I've been able to elaborate at least 10 different enjoyable emotions, which I believe are as different from each other as fear is from anger. For example, consider the difference between amusement and relief. They both feel good. They have a very different signal, auditory signal. I think you're finding, but no one's really, well, there's just a paper published by a student of mine, Disa Sauter. Is it published or has it just been accepted in PNAS? Anyhow, it shows the universality of the vocal signal for 5 of these 10 emotions. It's just the others haven't been studied. I do believe the voice is the signal system that differentiates among the enjoyable ones. So how many are there? Well, if you allow vocal signals in, and I didn't design this system, surely you should, then there are probably somewhere between 12 and 20 emotions that have this characteristic. And then there are these strange things that don't have a signal. If I was Steve Pinker, I could make up a reason for you as to why shame and guilt don't have a signal, okay? But I wasn't there, and the fossil record doesn't tell us a lot about social life in the ancestral environment, other than that we know it was a primary shaper. If we were still hunters and gatherers, our emotions would be a lot more functional than they are for us now. But you wouldn't be able to go 50 miles an hour, let alone 60 on a freeway, if there hadn't been things like saber-toothed tigers in the ancestral environment. Our emotions prepare us to deal without having to think about it.
Yeah, these are pickups now.
Okay. You're on.
I'm on. So the term destructive emotions is a misnomer to you.
It's
Why?
worse. It's misleading. If emotions were destructive, I mean, why would they be still there? So what I was able to convince the Dalai Lama, at least enough to get it into the book, I've noticed the last 2 times I've met with him in the last few months, he keeps slipping back. And I feel like I'm a school teacher. No, come on, remember what you agreed to? That every emotion can be experienced and enacted in a constructive or destructive way, and that the criteria, this he really liked, of which it is whether it furthers collaboration between you and that other person. We are social animals, and if you express an emotion in a way that you don't want to talk to me again, or procreate, or work on anything, that's destructive. And so that's why I thought that, and unfortunately, my friend Danny Goldman, the name of that book is Destructive Emotions. And Incidentally, if you notice, hatred and love, I now have come to believe that hatred is fundamentally, though it has a short-term benefit, it's long-term corrosive, and I mean that literally, on the emotion system, and has some very painful consequences.
So you've touched on this, and maybe a little bit you can make it more explicit. The process of not engaging in destructive acts to self or others in the presence of strong emotion takes elements of cognitive control and what I would call some kind of embodied wisdom. Seeing the downstream consequences of your acts, can you speak to what is involved in implementing non-destructive behavior in the presence of strong emotion?
I'm just going to give you one example, and it's in Dick Lazarus's next to the last book, and I know that Dick knew nothing about Buddhism. It's a central idea in Buddhist thought, and that is constructive anger, although they don't use it those terms, is using whatever force is necessary to stop harm to you or others, and compassion towards the actor to help them achieve their goals in another way. Now that takes a lot of skill. I now can do that maybe 50% of the time. And I feel, when I do, enormously uplifted about that achievement. Because, and this is another thing discussed in the book with the Dalai Lama, you know, is hurting the target of the emotion, is that intrinsic to the nature of anger, or is that socially learned through early experience? You know, when an infant flails, it's likely to hit whoever is near the flailing. So we all have the opportunity, and you know that usually has an effect on people. So things that have an effect get strengthened. In a practical sense, it doesn't really matter. The impulse to harm is an issue always to deal with when experiencing anger. Now, I take the coward's way out whenever it's possible, which is to regard anger as a signal to me that I have a problem to deal with when I'm not angry. Never deal with an important problem when angry if you have a choice. Now, if somebody's trying to mug me, even with I once bargained with a mugger over the price. And I succeeded and walked away unharmed.
Now that's a lesson.
That's a lesson. Okay.
All of us that hopefully we don't have to learn in real time. So this brings us to consider our capacity for compassion. First, what is compassion in your view? Does it overlap with empathy, with sympathy? Is it an emotion?
I'm glad I brought this.
Are there different kinds of compassion?
Yes, and you already know this, but those were very rhetorical questions. The sine qua non is recognizing the other person's emotional state. If I don't know how you feel, I can't do anything about it, okay? That we know how to teach people. We know how to teach people who are handicapped, like people with severe schizophrenia. It's easy to learn. We even have online tools to do that. Most of us don't need to learn it. The problem, of course, and I only really know, there's one study, there's one unpublished Stanford dissertation that showed the impact of your own emotional state in distorting your perception of the emotions of others. So, if I want to be a good torturer, I need emotion recognition in order to adjust it. I don't want to kill you, I just want to make it unbearable. How do I know it's unbearable if I can't read your state? Okay, the second thing is emotional resonance. And this is a very tricky thing. There's two kinds of resonance. I like to use this example, which my wife doesn't like me to use, but I only use it because it didn't happen, okay? When she was dean of graduate studies at Berkeley, she comes home one night. This is fiction. It's in the book, though. It does say it's fiction. And she says, that chancellor, he won't give me enough money for the graduate students. If we don't have the top-notch graduate students, we'll lose the faculty. Can't he understand this has to be the highest priority? Okay, resonance type 1. That rat, what's wrong? You have to deal with that. I'd like to call him up and tell him, what's wrong with you? So I'm now feeling the same anger she's feeling. And she'll like that. We like people who resonate. But here's resonance type 2. Oh, honey, what can I do? Can I give you a massage? You have to put up with this. Terrible. So this is the comforting kind of resonance. And I actually do feel it. It's not a false thing. People like that too. Okay? So resonance, though, can get you into burnout. The Dalai Lama says you have to have resonance with courage. It has to be just a momentary thing. Otherwise, it overwhelms you. My daughter's been working in SF General's Emergency Trauma Center. And the typical burnout there is about a year and a half. You just see so much, so many unfortunate events. And if you resonate to every killing that comes in, it's going to overwhelm the system. We weren't designed. When I lived in a village in New Guinea, those people never left that village, and they didn't see as much suffering in a decade as I see on TV in an evening. We're not prepared for dealing with that much suffering. So now we have familial compassion. You asked how many types of compassion? I think I distinguish, I have to check, 3 or 4. But familial is a given. It is the willingness, more than willingness, it's without thought what the parent does to relieve the suffering of the infant. We wouldn't survive as a species if that wasn't built into us. Okay? We don't think it's remarkable if a parent even puts their own life at risk to save the infant. It's not going to make the front page of the newspaper. That's what we expect. We expect it because it is a given. Now, is it an emotion? You didn't ask me that question, so I don't know that I'll answer it. Oh, you did. Well, it's universal, it's unbidden. As a fast appraisal, it's influenced by both ontogeny and phylogeny. These are all things it shares with emotion. What's the distinctive physiology? Well, emotions have distinctive physiology. This must, in order, maybe it's not coming out of the ether, okay? So probably. If there's distinctive physiology, there are probably distinctive sensations that feed back into the system, as there is for emotions. Is there a distinctive signal? I'll bet you not that there isn't a signal for compassion. I know even former postdocs of mine claim there is, but the data to me is not convincing. Is it shared with other primates? It certainly is. So I'm willing to say familial compassion is like an emotion. Maybe it is an emotion. But now let's consider global. That's when you feel that same way as you felt towards your infant, towards all human beings. Now that's a goal for some certain types of religious training, but there are some people who have it with no training. How do we explain that? Mutation? Are they sort of the freaks of nature? Thank God there are a few of them around. Can it be acquired? I think that's still a researchable question. Will the planet survive if we don't all develop some of that? I think no, it won't. Not the way we know it. Then let's take it a step further, which is sentient compassion for all living beings. None of the Abrahamic religions have sentient compassion as the goal. Not Judaism, not Christianity, not Islam. Buddhism, it's the exception. Darwin, in his best known and least read book, That phrase, incidentally, is Desmond Morris, not Desmond, Morris and Moore in their wonderful biography of Darwin. Darwin says sentient compassion is the highest moral virtue. Darwin's view of the origins of compassion and of moral virtue are identical to the Buddhists. And I've been recently able to establish, he came on this with, before he learned it, about 7 years before he heard anything about Buddhism. So it was an independent arrival, the same really unusual and extreme view of morality. Well, most people don't have sentient compassion at all, but some do, and some do with no training. They don't have to go to 3-month retreats to try to develop it. It's just there. Why? How did it get there? Does everyone who has global have sentient? Then heroic, the last. Heroic is the person who jumps into the pond to save a total stranger, putting their own life at risk and often not surviving. Jumps down to the subway. Most of us don't know whether we have it. We haven't been tested. We weren't standing on the shore and not jumping. But we do know, and that's the only thing that's been studied by a woman named Kristen Monroe at UC Irvine, a political scientist. And of course, being a political scientist, when she studied these people, she didn't ask them any questions of a psychological nature, but demographically, they're indistinguishable. And what they say is, I had no choice. I had to do that. I didn't think about it. Should I do it or shouldn't? I did it. I had to. Buddhists really like this. They're human beings. I had to rescue them. Okay. Well, there's some people, again, who have heroic. We do know more about how to inculcate it. The military knows more. Not everybody jumps on the grenade who could have. But there's a high incidence when you build a strong connection among a small group. Now, how do we do that for total strangers and put our life at risk to save them? Is that setting the bar too high? So those are the distinctions that my article on Darwin's view of human nature is coming out in JAMA next week. And Erica Rosenberg, who many of you know, and I are working on a paper on these distinctions that I just described.
So I want to have some time to talk about deception. So I want to tie into what you've just said about the bar being so high and these extraordinary individuals. And you've talked about the Dalai Lama as a Mozart of compassion.
Mozart of the mind.
So we've all met individuals with great kindness and compassion, a certain twinkle of warmth. What can be expected of poor schlubs like us?
Well, again, we discussed that in the book, that, there are a lot of other features of the Dalai Lama that are unique beyond compassion. I don't know anyone else who's having such a good time. And I never have such a good time talking to anyone else. But then we actually spent, now we're up to 42 hours, 43 hours. I've never spent 43 hours with anyone talking about a single set of conceptual issues. So maybe I would have such a good time, be laughing all the time with anyone, I doubt it. He is an amazing person in many respects. Now I've just committed one of B.F. Skinner's warnings not to do, which is to go off on a tangent and I can't remember the question.
What can schlubs expect to attain?
Our goal, this is one of the positives.
This training.
This is one of the emotions, enjoyable emotions, which we don't have a word for, but the Italians do, which is the emotion when we stretch ourselves to our limit in our intellectual, physical, or humane capacity. And it's extremely enjoyable to do it. It's what motivates so much great work that's done, is you want to be able to get a sentence that sings, and it feels so good. It has nothing to do with competition. It's enlarging yourself. So the goal is you know, I know our mutual friend Matthew Ricard says that only a rare few individuals can become Olympic-class javelin throwers, but we can all learn to throw it better than we do now. So I think we can, if we don't, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and I had classmates like Susan Sontag and Mike Nichols, people who realized that they weren't going to get to that height killed themselves. That was the destructive part of that university. You thought if you couldn't be the best, you were no one. You have to be the best that you can be. Amos Oz said in his recent autobiography what his aunt taught him, which is that we don't determine the hand we're dealt with by nature. But some of us play a bad hand beautifully, and some of us play a good hand terribly. What he didn't say is who deals the card that determines how you play your hand. But that's your goal, is to play your hand as best you can and as best it allows you.
So what is this Italian word?
Fiero. It's one of my 10 enjoyable emotions, or maybe 12, I can't remember.
Great. One quick question about compassion before, and research. So a lot of research paradigms study compassion meditation. That is, visualization exercises focused on the wish for self and others, broadly construed, as you've talked about, to be free from suffering. What do you think can be learned from studying individuals practicing compassion meditation? How does it relate to your understanding of compassion?
If I was going to do research on compassion, and the NIMH, which supported me for 43 years, was back where it was 30 years ago, was willing to support high-risk, straight behavioral science research, which it don't do anymore, I would not focus on that. I would focus on those people who have it without training. What's their brain like? What's their upbringing like? How did it come into being? I've had some arguments with our mutual friend Richie Davidson, and we may write an article together in which we totally disagree with each other. But he's ignoring the outliers. There are outliers. There are people in everybody's data who's looked at things like global compassion. There are people who they're just like that. I'll tell you a very fast a story that bridges over. I have a test on how well you can tell whether someone's lying.
You said the word secret.
I'm going to tell you a secret. And I've given this test to over 15,000 people in every discipline. Almost everyone is close to chance. There are a few groups, like the U.S. Secret Service, where 2/3 of them are at 80% accuracy. And there are a few other groups like that, not many. So I was testing a group of college students because you can't get something published if you don't have undergraduates as part of your sample. Was there a contempt expression when I said that, Eric? And I had one student who got 90% accurate. So I went up to this guy afterwards, asked him things about himself. And I said, well, what are you planning to do in your life? He said, become a U.S. Secret Service. It's an N of 1. Highly improbable, but still an N of 1. So how did these people get to be how they are? Can we learn anything from the study of them that will help us teach others to move in that direction? But just like we shouldn't expect everyone to be an Olympic javelin thrower, if you set the bar too high, all you're going to do is discourage people. And we want to get people not to spend their life in retreats, but out benefiting the world. And we want, particularly in Western societies, if we don't develop a more global sense of compassion, we're not going to be willing to make some of the adjustments that may be necessary in order to help other countries come up to our standard of living and be willing to make some of the sacrifices that right now Did you know that Bin Laden has a new thing on Al Jazeera saying global warming is the fault of the United States? And now they're expecting us to pay the price for all the destruction they've done to the environment? Hey, Osama bin Laden is Al Gore. Isn't that something? It's better than blowing people up.
So let's,
Maybe we could get a summit meeting of the two of them.
oh,
We guarantee them safe passage.
that's something
Okay,
to
sorry.
consider. So let's change this flip side of this wonderful record we're creating here. So let's talk a little bit about deception in our remaining time. Lie to Me, the Fox series based on your work and bits and pieces of your life, makes it look like underlying all deception is an inadvertent sign of the fact of deception. Is someone with the right training can always see that there is in fact deception that's taking place. Is this true?
No.
Next question?
I felt I owe you quite a few of those one-word answers.
That's fine. So you've developed...
Incidentally, when
Yes?
I train interrogators, police or military, I have something called the sins of interviewing. One of the sin is to ask a question that can be answered yes or no.
I am guilty, but can you tell? So you've developed training tools to help anyone notice micro-expressions. For instance, it almost looked like Obama showed a brief contempt expression the other night during the pause after he said, "Despite overwhelming scientific evidence, some of you do not believe global warming is real." Who are using the tools of micro-expression?
The micro-expression training tool, which is on the internet now, and anyone who pays a nominal fee, it cost me about $500,000 to create it. No grant support. So I'm trying to recoup what I've spent so I can build some more. I have 6 more tools that I want to get on the internet that will allow people to learn different kinds of skills related to emotion without having to be in a classroom. Classroom, you just can't reach the number of people who need to be reached. Anyhow, what it teaches you how to do, there are 3 sources. It teaches you how to recognize concealed emotions. Doesn't teach you why people are concealing the emotion. Doesn't tell you what triggered the emotions. Emotions don't, even macro emotions don't tell you their source. You have to figure that out by further questioning or by the social context. But it is important to know that you're feeling anger, not fear, and that you're trying to conceal it. It's important to the health professionals, so we teach all the students at Mayo Clinic and the staff how to recognize microexpressions. And I don't worry about their invading privacy. If they can get you to take off your clothes and put their fingers in your orifices, they could surely recognize your concealed emotions and say, is something bothering you? Or they could perhaps go further. Are you really worried about the treatment? If you don't bring it out, I think there's enough evidence to show you're going to get less compliance. We did show that salesmen who learn to do this, 40 minutes, are more successful in sales and better liked by their co-salesmen. That was not a study very high in my priority, but...
So at one point you said Microsoft was using this.
Oh, Microsoft was my first customer. They bought 400 copies in the days when I was selling it CD. I now no longer know who gets it. I mean, I could find out from PayPal, but I don't. I leave that. There are a lot of people. I used to block credit cards from non-democracies. And then my intelligence, not intelligent, my intelligence friend said, all you're doing is making it available just to the government, because they have workarounds. And the people within those countries who might use it for good, they don't have the workarounds. So now anybody, and I do know, because I get correspondence about it, the Iranians, the Chinese. I didn't make it for them, but I'm hoping it's doing more help than good. We do know from research that I've done jointly with former postdoc Mark Frank that facial expressions are the single most important source for detecting high-stake lies. It's good enough to get 001 level of significance, not good enough to have any practical use. To get over 90% accuracy, you have to look at every aspect of demeanor, not just the face. It's just that the face is the single most important source of any measure that we've drawn. Did that answer that?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine. So I know of no one on the planet with a daily life that could include back-to-back meetings with the Dalai Lama and the Department of Homeland Security.
He
So
liked that, incidentally. He saw no contradiction.
I see your efforts here as a compassionate engagement with your expertise and our vulnerability to terrorist attacks. With the Olympian effort that terrorists go through to cloak their intentions, one would think that they could select individuals who might pass all observational tests. Your role implies that they do not. This then is a natural experiment that demonstrates the overwhelming signal strength of something related to the truth. What do you see as the evolutionary advantage of this uncloaking, given the obvious strategic advantage of deception?
Well, here's where I disagree with Dawkins and in print. I can't remember when I published this, but in the last 10 years. And it's very consistent with this unknown view of human nature of Darwin's that publishing next week. The living in a Stone Age village in New Guinea, it was clear what it was clear to Darwin in his voyage of the Beagle 100 years, more than 100 years before. Humans don't exist without collaborative effort. You don't deal with, there weren't many predators, but there were some in New Guinea. But you need to work with other people. Also, in that environment, so if you are caught as a liar, you're ostracized. If you're ostracized, you're dead. So are your offspring. So there's a selective weeding out of those people, this is totally anti-Dawkins, of those people who are the most selfish, because they get caught. Now, in that village, there were no rooms with doors, let alone rooms you could rent by the hour. You couldn't change villages, because no one else would let you in. Here we can, you get into trouble here, bad reputation. You could change your name, you can move to another city, get another spouse. All of that was unavailable in the ancestral environment, I'm betting, based on my experience in New Guinea. So it's a situation to select people who are capable of cooperation. Now you put those people down in the environments that we now live in, where exploitation, you can get away with quite a lot of exploitation until you get caught. How many people, what percent, I like to believe that exploiters all get caught eventually. How would I know? It's like I get asked, how often do people tell serious lies? How would I know? Would I be as foolish as my social psychology contemporaries who ask them? What makes you think that a liar is going to tell you how often they lie? Let alone what makes you think they know and remember. So until there's an invisible cloak available, we'll never know how often people tell serious lies. And it's just a view of the world. I think now there's a lot of evidence that people who have a more optimistic view of human nature and of the world, they live longer. My colleague Wally Friesen did this wonderful study that I don't know whether you know about, in which it was part of the nun study, in which he took these autobiographies these women wrote at 17 or 18 in order to get into the nunnery. And he simply counted the number of positive and negative emotional words they used. And the more emotional words, the greater the longevity controlling for everything else. It really accounted for a lot.
Longevity in the nunnery or longevity,
Longevity
of
just
living?
living, how long they lived. And I know what he doesn't know. It may not matter how bad your early environment if you write about it in a positive way. I mean, they didn't have much choice. They did the best thing. I mean, I could think of nice things to say about my rotten parents. Okay? I don't usually say them. But since reading Wally's findings, I'm trying to develop that perspective on my early life.
Right.
Question.
So this is about the future of lie detection. So advances in computer science and neuroimaging are yielding initial results of crude mind reading devices, where categories of thought can be distinguished by pattern recognition of machine learning of fMRI and EEG signals. And now there are even classified research efforts that are ongoing that are beginning to try to employ this in the field. So an attitude is beginning to emerge: who needs nonverbal behavior when you can observe the brain? What do you think of this?
As a taxpayer, I'm outraged. As a scientist, what I know of that research, and I knew about it before it all got classified. It was as stupid as the rest of the social psychological research on deception, where you randomly assign people, which the world does not do, to lie or tell the truth, where there are no serious consequences for the person misjudged, the truthful person misjudged to be lying, where the lie is totally has no relevance to their past or their intended future. Come on, that's not what we're trying to deal with. So, look, there's an unwritten rule by program managers in DoD, which is if a machine can't do it, it's not worth doing. The Israelis have done very well. I worked with them a decade ago. They've done very well by using highly trained human observers. The Israelis have more protection than we have because we're dumping the money in tech and not in training enough. In the majority of now they only have one airport, but if you look at the difference in the GNP between Israel and the United States, we could equal what they're doing in terms of trained observers, and we're not doing it. The Senate Appropriations Committee just said no more training of people who do observational work in airports, even though there's a soon-to-be-published study by American Institute of Research with 132,000 subjects randomly assigned to either randomly screened or picked out by the people who've been trained with my methods. The people trained with my methods had 12 times the hit rate of people who were smuggling contraband or guns or were wanted felons. So it's working. We're cutting it out. No more. There is no airport in the United States where every traffic line is watched. There's no airport in Israel where every traffic line is not watched. Why don't we deserve the same level of protection? This is the subject of an op-ed I'm writing. It'll be on the CBS Sunday Morning News, I think, in 2 weeks.
So I want to end on it. We're just about out of time, and I want to end on a lighter note, which could be in defense of white lies. We know that clod-footed husbands who don't like every haircut or dress their wives by are instructed, if they know what's good for them, to always like every haircut and outfit. Clearly, mild deception is in some way, very grassroots way, adaptive to procreation. Can you speak to this?
Well, there's the saying, all's fair in love and war. If you believe the person who wants to go to bed with you is telling you the truth, then you're believing the used car salesman who's saying, this is just a little old lady. I mean, there's lots of incentives for not telling the truth. But more generally, I don't classify politeness or flattery as a lie, because we expect to get it. In a lie, there is no, Uri Geller is a liar. A magician is not. A magician tells you it's not true, okay? There's a big difference between an imposter and an actor, okay? We know. If it's a good actor, we get carried away and believe them. But afterwards, we know that was just great acting. So I'm serious lies, even that are sometimes justified. Somebody, St. Thomas said, if somebody comes into your house with a large knife in their hand and says, "Where's your brother? I'm going to kill them," you don't say he's asleep in the next door room. But lying is a slippery slope. I'll close with an example that the cops gave me last week. It's really clever. So I hope you won't regard this as a sexist remark. So your wife says, "Does my dress make me look fat?" And you say, "Absolutely not, honey," and you're telling the truth, because it isn't her dress, it's the fact. If you wanted to tell the truth, you would say, "Honey, for the amount of weight you've gained, you shouldn't wear that dress." Lots of luck doing that.
Thank you so much, Paul. Do we have time for questions or not?
I think we should open this up in, maybe 5 minutes or so of questions if anybody wants to ask a question.
And then there'll also be a lunch after.
When
You
I've
can judge whether the answer is the truth or not.
When I've given lectures, which I try to avoid doing whenever possible, the only part that's fun is the question period. Because everything I say in a lecture I already know. But your questions, you don't know what kind of a question you're going to get asked. But this has been just a lot of fun, because although I had some hunch, I was totally unbriefed about what he was going to ask. And there were some much more unpleasant questions he could have asked, and you didn't, my friend. Okay, so question, yes?
Could you talk a little, you focused a lot on facial expression per se. I'm curious about what do you think the role of eye gaze is in things like deception or lying or even in emotion?
It's one of the things we do measure. We measure both face direction and gaze direction. And there is some payoff. That is, it does account for some of the variance. Everybody who studies emotion should have as a motto individual differences. Individuals differ in almost every respect. So for some people, gaze is going to have much more payoff than others. We're accustomed to analyzing data on a group basis. If you're going to use it, you want to look at it case by case by case. And so for some people, gaze and facing, and particularly when they're different from each other and where they occur within a sentence, really important. I used to criticize the gaze people for acting as if the eyes are inserted into a sheet of smooth muscle, because they just ignored. If I look at you with fear or with anger or with sadness, those aren't the same. I can still be looking at you, and it's important to know I'm looking at you rather than looking away. But similarly, people who do facial expression, and we built a very crude system for looking at head direction and gaze. I got tired of methodology after 6 years of it. I wanted to start doing some work. So it's very important. Another question?
You mentioned talking about studying people that have global compassion as this outlier group, and that makes a lot of sense. How do you figure out who has global compassion if you want to do it?
Doctors Without Borders. There are groups of people, and of course I want to compare people in that group with yoked controls who grew up in the same circumstances, who had parents with the same background, same amount of religious education. Kristen Monroe's book, which I think is called The Heart of Altruism, and I have no reason to disbelieve her data, she's got a lot of it, is you're not going to get an answer there. I do think you're going to find, if you don't find differences in their brains, then you aren't measuring the right things. But then the question is, when did they first appear? Are these givens, or were these acquired in some way? But it's a starting point, and heroics are really easy to find. You can find the biggest group of heroics you can find is in the military. They know who they are. They're happening, unfortunately, all the time. And you want to compare them to people who are in the same situation and could have acted heroically and didn't. So what's different about them? I mean, it's an unbelievable data source, and nobody's looking at it. It's not because I can put you in touch with the right people at West Point who are very interested, but they're not going to do this research. Okay? Their hands are more than full. But I mean, I think there are lots of situations. You know, every time somebody engages in heroic compassion, it gets into a local newspaper. So you could get a large sample by simply doing newspaper searches in major cities. And I talked to the Dalai Lama about this, and he's very eager. This is one of the he gave it his blessing for what it was worth, but he doesn't. You know, he's not. It's not up to him, and he doesn't have the tools to do this kind of research. But many of you sitting in this room do, and it's important. And I think, apart from having a lot of practical importance, we could learn a lot that's important about understanding human nature and brain function, social attitudes, etc. Another question? Yes.
Seeing as how all these emotions that we've evolved with have sort of evolved in a very specific circumstance, like you said, the closed villages and things like that, for translating all of that sort of genetic basis into sort of the modern world, do you think we have to sort of more learn how to reshape our emotions or reshape the way that society is structured?
I mean, that's a really very good question, and it's hard to give a fast response. I do believe people can learn to be more emotionally skilled. I don't think, though, that's easy to learn. And I believe it takes regular practice to maintain the skill. I like to compare emotional skills to learning to ride a bicycle. I went for 25 years without riding a bicycle and got right on and rode again. We're prepared, I think, to learn visual motor coordination skills easily, and once learned, you don't need to practice them. I don't think that's at all the case if we're going to recognize the impulse before the action, or just during the emotion to recognize I'm being emotional. I think emotions were designed to keep consciousness out, not muck around and interfere with this system. And we have to bring consciousness in. And we shouldn't expect nature to give us a lot of help. But I do think it's learnable. And I don't think there's one approach, one size fits all. I think individuals will differ in terms of which approaches are going to be most beneficial to establishing emotional skills. And I wouldn't like to see an effort that just focuses on one, but an array. When I go to the gymnasium near my apartment, there are all kinds of machines, and I can find the one that works best for me. Okay? In a compassion gymnasium, you want all kinds of things available that you can try and see what works best for you. That's what we need. And actually, the idea that we need such a gymnasium, that was Alan Wallace in 2000. He said, why don't we have a gymnasium for the mind? Why do we just have them for the skeletal muscles? But there are some people beginning to work on that kind of idea. Yes?
Has anyone looked at the brain before this deception training and then after?
No, but I could get subjects for you who are, who aren't doing this for fun. They're doing it on the job. And but you'd have to tell me beforehand in order to get these people to be willing to be subjects, what's going to be the benefit? Now, there may well be some people who can learn this better than others, and you might discover that. There might be some people who don't need refreshers and others do. all of these things, they're not in the elbow, they're in the brain. Do we have the tools to find them? We know that those differences occur. Nobody's examining that. Deception, whether it's in the issue of child abuse or malingering, there was a point at which, I love NIMH. I dedicated my next to the last book to NIMH and named the program officers without whom I would have been able to do nothing. But they wrote to me about 25 years ago and said, anything you publish on deception, do not cite our support. Because deception is off the table for NIMH. My God, sanity determinations, malingering, child abuse. So somebody must have wrapped their knuckles and said that belongs to the Department of Justice or DOD, someone else. That's changed. But the problem is it's hard to get money for anything from NIMH these days.
Oh, we take one more question.
You choose it.
Go ahead.
Do you have an idea about whether it's easier to learn to be emotionally skilled as a young child versus?
The Dalai Lama believes that's the entry point, and that's where the effort should be. And my counter to him on that, because he loves to disagree, and he deals with so many reverential people who don't want to challenge him, and he'll challenge you. He challenges you without any animosity. But you know, he's had more training in debate than he has in what we think of as mindfulness or other kinds of meditation. He's a spectacular, and he can be a bit of a sophist because he'll try things on, see whether you can think of a way of knocking it down. Okay? So what I say to him is, the people who are making the life and death decisions about our planet aren't the 5-year-olds. We need interventions that can work with them, with the people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. In all likelihood, the earlier the entry point, the better and the easier it's going to be. But if we don't work with the 20 to 50-year-old group, they're going to live in a terrible planet. So you have to work on many levels at once, and we're not doing it, not nearly enough. Thank you very much.